The wind in Wyoming doesn't just blow, it cuts. It howls down from the mountains like a hungry wolf, carrying the kind of cold that gets into your bones and stays there. For Ethan Rollins, that cold had settled in his heart 3 years ago, and nothing had been able to thaw it since. He stood on the porch of his ranch house, a palace of dark wood and stone, and watched the sun bleed out over the horizon. He was 32 years old, the richest man for 100 miles in any direction. He owned 5,000 acres of prime land, more cattle than he could count, and a house filled with fancy things from cities he'd never seen. Persian rugs, crystal lamps, leather-bound books that smelled of money and dust. None of it mattered. None of it could fill the deafening silence left behind by his wife, Sarah, and their boy, James. The fever had taken them quick, and he'd buried them himself on the little hill behind the cottonwood trees. Since then, he'd done the only thing he knew how to do: work. He built his empire bigger, stronger, as if he could build a wall high enough to keep the ghosts out. But as the shadows grew long and swallowed the valley, Ethan knew he wasn't outrunning anything. He was just a man standing still, haunted by the life he'd lost. "Mr. Rollins?" The voice was so timid it was almost part of the wind. He turned, pulled from his thoughts. In the doorway stood Clara Bennett, the new maid. She'd been there 3 weeks, shipped in from somewhere back east Ohio, he thought. She couldn't have been more than 20. Her hair, the color of dry wheat, was pulled back so tight it looked painful. Her eyes, a soft, stormy gray, were fixed on the floorboards as if looking at him directly was a crime. She clutched a thin shawl around her shoulders, her plain brown dress making her seem like a little bird, ready to fly at the first sudden move. "Yes, Miss Bennett," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "Supper's ready, sir. Mrs. Henderson said to tell you. It's beef stew." He just nodded, his gaze returning to the mountains. He could feel her still standing there, shifting her weight from one foot to the other, a bundle of nerves in his doorway. "Will you be taking it in the dining room, sir?" she finally whispered, her voice nearly stolen by the wind. He thought of that long, empty table, set for one. "The study," he said. "I have ledgers to get through." "Yes, sir." She gave a little curtsy, so quick he almost missed it, and vanished back into the warmth of the house. He stayed out on the porch a while longer, watching the first stars prick the deep purple sky. He didn't understand why this girl, this whisper of a person, stuck in his mind. Maybe it was her silence, a reflection of his own. Or maybe it was the way she moved through his house, like a ghost herself, afraid of leaving a single footprint. Inside, the study fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Books he never read stared down at him from their shelves. He preferred numbers. Numbers were clean. They didn't have memories. They just added up. Profit and loss, life and death. Simple. Clara came in with the tray, moving with a careful, deliberate slowness. Her hands, red and chapped from work, trembled just slightly as she set down the bowl of stew, the bread wrapped in a cloth, the glass of water. She arranged them on his desk with the precision of a surgeon, as if one wrong move would shatter the silence and bring his wrath down upon her. "Thank you," he grunted. She nodded, turning to leave, but her eyes snagged on the painting above his desk. It was the only soft thing in the room. Sarah, radiant in her wedding dress, holding baby James, his little face a perfect copy of hers. "You had a beautiful family, sir," Clara said, her voice barely audible. She immediately bit her lip, her cheeks flushing, as if she'd spoken a terrible secret aloud. "They were," was all he could manage. She fled then, closing the door softly behind her. Ethan stared at the stew, the steam rising like a phantom. He ate, but he tasted nothing. His eyes kept flicking from the closed door to the smiling faces in the portrait. That night he worked until his eyes burned, the scratching of his pen the only sound in the great empty house. As he finally climbed the grand staircase toward his cold bedroom, a sound stopped him, a voice, soft, low, drifting from the kitchen. He paused, his hand on the banister. It was her, Clara. He moved without thinking, his stocking feet silent on the polished wood floors. He stopped just outside the kitchen door, hidden in the deep shadows of the hallway. The lamp was on, casting a warm, yellow glow. Clara stood with her back to him, washing the last of the supper dishes in a large basin. And she was talking. Not to anyone, just to the room, to the silence. "Tomorrow I'll dust the parlor," she murmured, her voice a low, rhythmic hum. "Mr. Rollins doesn't use it, but it should still be proper. And the silver, I'll polish it again. Mrs. Henderson says once a week is enough, but such fine things should shine." Her voice caught on a little sob. Her shoulders trembled. She gripped the edge of the sink, her knuckles white. "No crying, Clara Marie," she whispered fiercely to herself. "You're lucky. You have a roof. You have wages. Some girls end up much worse." She took a shaky breath. "Mr. Rollins is a fair man, even if he looks so sad all the time." She paused, scrubbing a plate with renewed vigor. "Those eyes, it's like he's staring straight at ghosts." Ethan felt the air leave his lungs. He stepped back, melting deeper into the shadows. Ghosts. She saw them too. The next night he didn't wait to stumble upon her. He planned it. After his meal, he left the dirty dishes on his desk. He let the fire in the study burn down to glowing embers. He sat in his big leather chair, loosened his collar, and closed his eyes, steadying his breath until it was deep and even. To anyone who entered, he would look like a man who had simply worked himself to exhaustion and fallen asleep at his desk. He waited. The house was silent, save for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall and the sighing of the wind outside. Then he heard it, the faint creak of the door. Her footsteps were light, barely disturbing the dust motes dancing in the faint moonlight. He heard the gentle clink of dishes as she gathered them onto her tray. The silence stretched. He fought the urge to open his eyes to see what she was doing. He felt her move closer. Her shadow fell over him. Then something impossibly soft brushed against him. She was pulling the heavy wool blanket from the back of his chair and draping it carefully over his shoulders, tucking it in around his neck. "Poor man," she whispered, her voice thick with a pity he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. "Working yourself into the ground. It won't bring them back." He felt a jolt, a current of shock that he had to suppress with all his will. He kept his breathing slow even. She continued, her voice a fragile thread in the quiet room. "I know. I tried it myself." What did she mean? What had she lost? Ethan's mind raced, but his body remained perfectly still. He heard her move to the hearth, the soft scrape of the poker as she gently coaxed the embers back to life. A small, warm glow began to fill the room again. She didn't leave. He could feel her standing there, her presence a silent weight in the room. He knew without seeing that she was looking at the portrait. "You had such a beautiful family, Mr. Rollins," she said, her voice directed at the painting, at the ghosts. "I hope you find some peace one day. The way you look at them when you think no one is watching, it breaks my heart." She sighed, a sound full of a weariness that seemed too old for her young shoulders. "I know what it's like to lose everything, but you're still here. You're still breathing. That has to count for something, doesn't it?" She turned to go, her footsteps moving toward the door. She paused one last time beside his chair. He could feel the warmth of her nearness. "Sleep well, sir," she whispered. "Tomorrow's a new day." The door clicked shut, leaving him alone in the firelight. Ethan didn't move for a long, long time. The warmth of the blanket seeped into his skin, but it was nothing compared to the fire she had just lit inside his frozen chest. This shy, quiet girl, who barely dared to look at him in the daylight, was speaking to his very soul in the dark. And her kindness. It was a weapon, piercing through the armor he had so carefully constructed. For the first time in 3 long years, Ethan Rollins found himself wondering what tomorrow might actually bring. The deception became a nightly ritual, a silent, one-sided conversation that Ethan came to crave more than food or sleep. Every evening he would stage his collapse into slumber, and every evening she would come. He learned the rhythm of her movements, the careful gathering of plates, the soft sweep of a cloth across his desk, the gentle stoking of the fire. She moved with a quiet grace that he'd never noticed during the day. In the dark, she wasn't just a timid maid. She was a guardian, a keeper of his silent, grieving house. Sometimes she would talk about her day, Small things like the way the sun hit the parlor curtains in the morning, or how Mrs. Henderson had taught her to bake a lighter bread. Harmless, simple chatter. But always, she would end her visit by the portrait. Her words for his lost family were like a balm on a wound he thought could never heal. On the third night of his charade, she did something new. After covering him with the blanket, she placed a small round tin on the side table near his chair. "Your hands, Mr. Rollins," she whispered, and he imagined her looking at his calloused, cracked knuckles. "They're chapped raw from the cold." He could hear her unscrewing the lid. A faint scent of beeswax and herbs filled the air. "Mama used to make this salve. It's good for burns and cracks. I hope, I hope you don't mind. I just thought it might help." His throat grew thick, a simple handmade gift from a girl who had nothing. He wanted to sit up, to thank her, to tell her that this small act of kindness meant more than all the gold in his safe. But he couldn't. He wouldn't break the spell. Not yet. By the fifth night, her whispers grew bolder, more personal. She was tidying his desk, and her fingers must have brushed against the ledgers. "Mrs. Henderson says you built all this with your own two hands," she murmured, her voice laced with an admiration that stunned him. "Papa would have liked that. He always said this was the land where a man could make himself into anything he wanted." Her voice hitched. "Of course, he said that about his investments, too. And, well, we all know how that ended." She quickly moved on, as if the memory was too painful to touch for long. "Still, I'm grateful for this job, for this roof." She paused and her voice dropped even lower, filled with a chilling fear. "Some of the girls on the train with me, they weren't so lucky. One of them, Mary, she went to a dance hall in Denver. She cried the whole last day of the trip. She knew what kind of job it really was." Clara took a deep, shuddering breath. "That could have been me. If you hadn't hired me, that would have been me." Ethan's hands, hidden beneath the blanket, clenched into tight fists. This girl, this fragile-looking creature, had walked through fire he couldn't even imagine. And here she was, tending to his fire, soothing his imaginary ills, grateful for a life of scrubbing floors because the alternative was a nightmare. He had seen her as a shadow, a function, a pair of hands to keep his house in order. He had been so blind. But it was on the seventh night that the strange, fragile world they had built in the darkness finally shattered. Clara entered the study right on schedule, the tray in her hands. But something was wrong. Her steps, usually so light and sure, were unsteady. In the flickering firelight, he could see a sheen of sweat on her forehead, and her face was flushed with a feverish heat. She set the tray down on the desk with a clatter, her hands trembling violently. She swayed on her feet, one hand flying to her head. "Just a little fever," she whispered to herself, her voice hoarse. "Finish the chores, Clara. Don't be weak. You can't be weak." She took a stumbling step toward the hearth and faltered, her knees buckling. Ethan could pretend no longer. In an instant, he was out of the chair, surging across the small space between them, catching her just as she was about to collapse onto the hard stone floor. "Miss Bennet!" His voice was a harsh crack in the silence. Her gray eyes flew open, wide with shock, confusion, and then a wave of pure, gut-wrenching shame. "You were awake," she gasped, the words a horrified exhalation. "All this time, you knew." "You're burning up," Ethan said, his voice rough with a concern that surprised them both. He easily lifted her, her body feeling as light as a child's in his arms. "You shouldn't even be on your feet." I'm fine," she protested weakly, trying to push away, but she had no strength. "Please don't tell Mrs. Henderson. If she thinks I can't work, she'll—" "Sit," Ethan commanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. He lowered her gently into the large leather chair he had just vacated, her head lolling against the back. She looked small and lost in its vastness. He strode to the door and bellowed for his housekeeper. Mrs. Henderson arrived moments later, her nightgown hastily covered by a robe, her expression a mask of disapproval at being summoned at such an hour. But her sharp eyes took one look at Clara, limp and shivering in the chair, and her face softened. "Fever," she clucked, pressing a hand to Clara's forehead. "I knew she looked pale at supper. The girl's been working herself to the bone." Clara shrank into herself, mortified. I didn't want to be a burden. Burden? The housekeeper scoffed, but her voice was surprisingly gentle. Nearly dying on your feet isn't a kindness to anyone, child. It's just foolishness. Ethan's jaw was a hard line. Send Tom for Dr. Morrison, now. Mrs. Henderson blinked, taken aback. Sir? At this hour? For a servant's fever? Ethan's gaze was like granite. She is one of my people. She is in my house. Send him. The housekeeper, knowing that tone, simply nodded and hurried away. Ethan turned back to Clara. Her cheeks were aflame. Whether from the fever or humiliation, he couldn't tell. You must think me such a fool, she whispered, her eyes swimming with tears. Talking to you like that. Saying all those things. He knelt before the chair, bringing his face level with hers. His voice, when he spoke, was softer than he'd heard it in years. Not foolish, Clara. Kind. Kinder than I've deserved in a long, long time. Her eyes overflowed then, silent tears tracing paths through the grime and sweat on her face. He reached out, hesitated, and then gently wiped one away with his thumb. The doctor arrived an hour later, grumbling about being pulled from a warm bed for a simple fever. But after examining Clara, his tone changed. He straightened up, his expression grim as he looked at Ethan. This is more than a fever, Rollins. It's exhaustion, malnutrition. She's worked herself into a state of collapse. She needs rest, proper food, and warmth. She'll live, but only if she stays in that bed for a week at least. He packed his bag, then gave Ethan a long, knowing look. It's strange to see you this worked up over a maid, but I'll be damned if it isn't good to see you care about something other than your cattle and your ledgers again. The doctor's words echoed in Ethan's mind long after he'd gone. When Clara was settled in her small, plain room in the attic, Ethan found himself standing in his silent study, staring at the little tin of salve she had left for him. A girl who had nothing had seen his invisible wounds and tried to heal them. And in doing so, she had nearly destroyed herself. The thought humbled him to his very core. He picked up the tin. It was warm, as if it still held the heat from her hands. For 3 days, Clara drifted in and out of a feverish sleep. Ethan forbade her from leaving her bed, a command that Mrs. Henderson enforced with the grim determination of a prison warden. Clara, in her few lucid moments, fretted constantly. She was a burden. She would lose her position. She wasn't earning her keep. The girl doesn't understand kindness, Mrs. Henderson remarked to Ethan one afternoon, shaking her head. It's like she's been kicked so many times she expects the boot, even when you're offering a hand. On the 4th day, the fever broke. Ethan knocked softly on her door and entered to find her propped up against the pillows, her face pale but her eyes clear. She was trying to mend a tear in her apron, her fingers still clumsy. The sight of him made her try to struggle upright. Mr. Rollins, sir. He waved her back down, pulling a small wooden chair close to her bedside. How are you feeling? He asked. Much better, sir. Truly. I can be back to work tomorrow morning, I promise. You'll return to your duties when Dr. Morrison says you're ready, and not a moment before? He paused, the air thick with unspoken things. He finally took a breath and met her gaze directly. I owe you an apology, Miss Bennet. Her brow furrowed in confusion. An apology? For what, sir? For deceiving you, he said, his voice low. For pretending to be asleep. For listening when I had no right to. A deep, painful blush spread from her neck to her hairline. She looked down at her hands, twisting the apron. Then you heard everything? Everything, he confirmed softly. Oh, she whispered, a sound of pure mortification. She covered her face with her hands. How utterly embarrassing. Not embarrassing, he said, reaching out and gently taking one of her hands. It felt small and fragile in his. Illuminating. Clara, your words, your kindness. You reminded me that there was still some good left in this world. You've done more to heal me in a few weeks than all my land and money ever could. Her eyes, when she finally looked up at him, were shining with unshed tears. I know what loss feels like, Mr. Rollins. I didn't want you to feel so alone with it. His grip on her hand tightened. You will do no more scrubbing floors. You will do no more hauling water. When you are well, You will be the head housekeeper. Your duties will be light, and your wages will be doubled. You've earned it." Her lips parted in disbelief. "But I've only been here a few weeks." "In those few weeks," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name, "you have shown more character and more heart than most people show in a lifetime." He stood to leave, needing to escape the intensity in the small room, but her voice, a mere whisper, stopped him at the door. "Mr. Rollins, were you really awake every single night?" He turned back, and for the first time in 3 years, a genuine small smile touched Ethan Rollins' lips. "Every single night." She let out a soft groan and buried her face in her hands again. But as Ethan walked away, he felt something unfurling in his chest, a feeling he had long thought buried with his wife and son. It felt like hope. The hope was tested just weeks later. February descended on the valley with a vengeance, a blizzard that came out of nowhere, a whirling monster of snow and ice. Ethan had ridden out to the north pasture to check on the pregnant heifers, underestimating the storm's speed. By the time he turned for home, the world had disappeared into a solid wall of white. Hours later, he didn't ride back to the ranch. He staggered. His horse was gone, lost to the storm. He was half frozen, his body a block of ice, his mind a fog of cold. He stumbled toward the lights of the house, a beacon in the howling chaos. The kitchen door flew open as if she had been waiting for him. Clara stood there, her face a pale oval in the lamplight, her eyes wide with terror. "Mr. Rollins!" she cried. He collapsed into the doorway, and she was there, catching his arm, her small frame straining under his dead weight. She and Mrs. Henderson dragged him inside, into the shocking, painful warmth of the kitchen. His hands were waxy and white, the first terrifying sign of deep frostbite. Without a moment's hesitation, Clara knelt on the floor in front of him, taking his frozen hands in her own, chafing them, trying to force life back into the deadened flesh. "Oh no," she whispered, her words a fierce, desperate prayer. "Not you. Not like this. Hold on, Ethan. Hold on." For the next hour it was a battle. They stripped off his frozen clothes, wrapped him in warm blankets, and spooned hot broth past his chattering teeth. The pain, when the feeling started to return to his limbs, was a white-hot agony. He cried out, his body convulsing, but through it all, Clara never let go of his hands. She held on, her own warmth a lifeline, her voice a constant, soothing murmur in his ear. "You're safe. You're home now. It's all right. Sleep. Sleep now." He drifted into the blackness, her voice the last thing he heard, her touch the only thing anchoring him to the world. When he finally woke, it was to the bright, clean light of morning. The storm had passed. Sunlight streamed through the window, painting a golden square on the floor. And the first thing he saw was Clara, asleep in a chair pulled up beside his bed. Her head was bowed in exhaustion, but her hand was still wrapped firmly, protectively, around his. In that quiet sunlit room, Ethan Rollins looked at the girl who had saved him, and for the first time since he had buried his family on the hill, he felt the cold finally, truly begin to recede. Spring came late to the valley that year, as if reluctant to trust that the winter was truly over. But eventually the snow melted, feeding the creeks until they ran loud and full. The land turned a vibrant, impossible green. Calves with clumsy legs dotted the pastures, and wildflowers exploded in bursts of color across the fields. It was a season of renewal, and for Ethan Rollins, the change was more than just weather. His heart, frozen for so long, was beginning to thaw. He had built his life on the foundation of his grief, a cold, empty fortress. But Clara Bennett, with her quiet strength and unexpected kindness, had found a way inside. She had breached the walls without force, simply by being herself. He started finding excuses to be near her. He'd ask her opinion on which flowers to place in the parlor, a room he hadn't entered in years. He'd linger in the kitchen while she prepared his tea, just to hear her talk. It was a slow, cautious dance. One afternoon, he found her in the sitting room, mending one of his shirts by the window. The afternoon sun caught in her wheat-colored hair, turning it to gold. She was so focused on her work, her brow furrowed in concentration, that she didn't hear him enter. He just stood in the doorway, watching her, a strange feeling blooming in his chest. She finally looked up, her gray eyes widening in surprise. "Mr. Rollins?" she said, her cheeks instantly flushing that familiar pink. "Ethan," he corrected softly, her hands stilled on the fabric. "Oh, I couldn't, sir. I shouldn't." He stepped into the room, moving closer until he was standing over her. "You have cared for me more honestly and more deeply than anyone has in 3 years," he said, his voice low and serious. "If anyone in this world has earned the right to call me by my name, Clara, it's you." Her lips trembled. She looked down at the shirt in her lap, then back up at him. "Ethan," she whispered. The sound of his own name, spoken in her soft voice, was the sweetest thing he had ever heard. A few weeks later, a neighboring ranch hosted a barn dance to celebrate the end of winter. The whole valley turned out. The air was filled with the lively music of fiddles and the sound of laughter echoing into the starry night. Ethan stood on the edge of the boisterous crowd, a lonely island in his fine wool coat and polished boots. He was the richest man here, the most powerful, and yet he had never felt more alone. Then he saw her. Clara was standing near the refreshment table, half hidden in the shadows. She was wearing a simple blue dress, probably her only good one, but to Ethan, she outshone every other woman in the barn. She looked nervous, twisting her hands together, her eyes darting around as if looking for an escape. A few of the younger ranch hands glanced her way, but none approached. She was too quiet, too plain, too unknown. She was the rich rancher's housekeeper, and that placed her in a strange no-man's land. Ethan didn't hesitate. He crossed the crowded floor, his boots making a determined sound on the wooden planks. Every eye followed him. He stopped in front of her. "Miss Bennett," he said, his voice carrying in a sudden lull in the music. He offered her his hand. "Would you do me the honor of this dance?" Her eyes went wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. "Oh, no, sir. Ethan, I couldn't. Everyone, everyone will stare." "Let them stare," he said, his voice firm but his eyes gentle. "Please." She looked from his outstretched hand to his face, and after a moment that seemed to stretch for an eternity, she slowly, hesitantly, placed her small hand in his. The music swelled again, and he led her on to the dance floor. Her first few steps were stiff and clumsy, her face burning with a self-conscious blush. But he held her steady, his hand firm on her back, guiding her through the steps. He smiled down at her, a real smile, and after a moment, she smiled back. And then he heard it, a sound he had never heard from her before. She laughed, a genuine, unguarded, joyous laugh that cut through the music and turned every head in the room. In that moment, surrounded by the warmth and the light and the music, holding this resilient, kind woman in his arms, Ethan felt the last of the ice around his heart crack and melt away. When the song ended, the crowd applauded, and Clara, flustered, tried to pull away. But Ethan held her hand fast. "One more?" he asked, his voice a low murmur just for her. She met his gaze, her gray eyes shining in the lantern light, and she nodded. One more. But not everyone in the barn was smiling. Whispers started to snake through the crowd, sharp and venomous. The wealthy, grieving widower and his plain little maid. It was a scandal. People said she was a fortune hunter, an opportunist preying on his loneliness. They said he was losing his mind, forgetting his station, dishonoring the memory of his sainted wife. The whispers followed Clara back from the dance. She felt them like stones thrown at her back in the general store. She saw them in the cold stares of the other women at church. She tried to ignore it, to hold her head high, but the gossip chipped away at her fragile confidence, awakening all her old fears of being worthless, of being a burden. One night, a week after the dance, she packed her few belongings into a small cloth bag. She would leave before dawn, slip away without a word. She couldn't bring shame upon this man, the first person who had ever shown her true kindness. She opened her bedroom door, ready to creep down the stairs and out into the darkness. But a figure was standing there, blocking her path, a tall silhouette in the dim moonlight filtering through the hall window. It was Ethan. He was waiting for her. "You were leaving," he said. It wasn't a question. Tears immediately sprang to her eyes, hot and shameful. I can't stay here. I can't be the cause of such trouble for you. The things people are saying. Let them talk, he cut in, his voice dangerously quiet. But his eyes, even in the darkness, burned with a fierce light. Clara, for 3 years I have lived in a prison of what people thought. I built a monument to my grief because it was what was expected, respectable, proper, and it left me hollowed out, a ghost in my own home. You, he took a step closer, you brought me back to life. I will not lose you to the idle, cruel gossip of fools. But you deserve a wife who is your equal, she sobbed, the tears now streaming down her face. Someone of your own standing. He was right in front of her now. He reached out and took both of her hands in his grip strong and sure. I have already found my equal, he said, his voice rough with emotion. My equal isn't measured in acres or dollars, Clara. It's measured in strength, in courage, in heart. And your heart is bigger and stronger than anyone's I have ever known. Her breath hitched, her whole body trembling. Ethan! He pulled her forward into his arms, holding her tight against his chest as if he would never let her go. Stay, he whispered into her hair. Stay and build a life with me. Not as my housekeeper, as my partner, as my equal, as my wife. Clara's broken sobs softened against his chest. She clung to him, this strong, solid man who saw her, who truly saw her, and she nodded, the movement barely perceptible. Yes, she whispered into the fabric of his shirt. Yes. The wedding was a quiet affair, held not in the church where judgmental eyes would watch, but on the small hill beneath the shade of the cottonwood trees, where Sarah and James lay at rest. Before the circuit preacher arrived, Ethan stood before the two simple wooden crosses and spoke to them softly, telling them about Clara, about the kindness that had saved him, asking for their blessing. As if in answer, a gentle breeze rustled through the leaves above. Clara wore a simple white dress Mrs. Henderson had helped her make, and her hands trembled in Ethan's as they spoke their vows. When the preacher finally declared them husband and wife, Ethan cupped her face in his hands and kissed her, a kiss that sealed not the end of one story, but the beginning of a new one. The valley would talk, he knew that, but for the first time, Ethan Rollins didn't care. Holding Clara's hand, he felt whole. She, who had arrived as a frightened maid with nothing but her own hidden pain, now stood beside him as his wife, his partner, his love. Together they walked back to the ranch house, two survivors who had found in each other a reason to face the sunrise. That night, lying in the quiet darkness of the master bedroom, Ethan turned to her and whispered the words she had once offered him like a prayer. Tomorrow is a new day. Clara smiled, her head resting on his chest, her heart finally at peace. Yes, she said softly, and this time, we'll face it together. If you believe that kindness is the greatest strength and that everyone deserves a second chance at happiness, hit that subscribe button and join us for more stories that will touch your heart. You never know what you might find.